History quietly hides a remarkable group of people. Not because they became famous, but because they spent decades looking completely ordinary. Ever noticed how biographies tend to begin at the end? We meet someone after they've become remarkable. The inventor, the artist, the writer, the explorer, the person whose photograph ends up in history books. And somewhere in our minds, a quiet assumption slips in. They must always have been that person. But that turns out not to be true at all. A few weeks ago, I stumbled across a list of people who didn't really begin the work they're remembered for until well into middle age. That sent me down a rather interesting rabbit hole. The more I looked, the stranger it became. History, it seems, has a habit of editing out the waiting. Let me introduce you to someone I suspect most of us have never heard of. Her name was Mary Delaney. For most of her life, she wasn't known as an artist at all. She managed households, wrote letters, spent time in gardens, and lived what history might easily have dismissed as an ordinary 18th century life. Then, in her early 70s, something unexpected happened. She began cutting tiny pieces of coloured paper. Not for crafts, for flowers. Petal by petal, leaf by leaf, she created astonishingly accurate botanical portraits entirely from paper. They were so detailed that botanists could identify the plants centuries later. Today they're considered masterpieces. What stayed with me wasn't simply that she started in her 70s. It was that she probably couldn't have created those works at 30. They weren't just made with careful hands. They were made with decades of noticing. Years spent looking closely at nature. Years spent learning, often without realizing she was learning. It made me wonder how many things in life aren't delayed by time at all. They're quietly being prepared by it. Psychologists have an interesting phrase. They talk about something called a narrative identity. It's the story we build about who we are. Here's the curious part. Research suggests we don't simply remember our lives. We continually rewrite them. Events that once seemed insignificant can suddenly become the turning point. Failures become preparation. Detours become essential chapters. We're all, in a sense, editing our autobiography as we go. I'd never connected that idea with people who found their life's work later. Maybe they weren't late at all. Maybe the story simply hadn't reached that chapter yet. There's another story that completely changed the way I think about beginnings. Imagine reaching your 80s. Most people would assume your biggest adventures are behind you. Instead, you buy a pair of running shoes. Not to keep fit, to run a marathon. That was Fauja Singh. He had lived through extraordinary hardship, including the upheaval of partition and the loss of close family members. Running became a way of finding his footing again. He completed his first marathon at 89. Then he kept going. By the time he was over 100 years old, he had become an international symbol of endurance, crossing finish lines that people half his age only dreamed of reaching. What struck me wasn't the records or the headlines. It was this simple thought. If someone had met him at 75, they would never have guessed that the part of his life the world would remember hadn't even begun. Sometimes a new chapter doesn't arrive because we planned it. Sometimes it appears because we quietly say yes to something that wasn't there before. What surprised me next wasn't about famous people at all. It was about language. In Japanese, there's a beautiful idea called ikigai. People often translate it as reason for being, but that's only part of it. The deeper meaning has less to do with finding one grand purpose. It's more about discovering small reasons to get up tomorrow. That changes everything. Because if purpose isn't one enormous destination, perhaps it isn't something you either have or don't have. Perhaps it grows. Perhaps it changes. Perhaps 70-year-old you has a different one from 40-year-old you. And that's perfectly normal. History offers another delightful surprise. Did you know that Grandma Moses didn't begin painting seriously until she was in her late 70s? Not because she'd always planned to become an artist. Quite the opposite. She loved embroidery, but arthritis eventually made stitching too painful. So someone suggested painting instead. One hobby quietly became another. Her paintings eventually hung in galleries around the world. Imagine if she'd insisted her creative life was over because one door had closed. Instead, another one appeared, almost by accident. That feels less like destiny and more like curiosity keeping a window open. Scientists studying the brain have discovered something encouraging. For much of the 20th century, people believed the adult brain gradually stopped changing. Now we know that's largely untrue. Our brains continue building new connections throughout life. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. The word sounds technical. The reality feels wonderfully hopeful. Every new language, every unfamiliar street, every recipe, every instrument, every friendship, every unexpected conversation. They all leave tiny physical traces inside the brain itself. We're far more unfinished than earlier generations ever imagined. That reminded me of something the novelist George Eliot once wrote. It is never too late to be what you might have been. It's one of those quotations that's become so familiar we almost stop hearing it. But read it slowly. She didn't say, become successful. She didn't say, become famous. She simply suggested we are not fixed. Considering she wrote those words in the 19th century, they feel surprisingly modern. And, in case you're wondering, George Eliot is the pseudonym created in 1857 by the aspiring writer Marian Evans. Now, back to my story. I found an odd historical pattern. Many remarkable discoveries were made by people who weren't necessarily young geniuses. Quite a few were experienced observers. People who had spent decades quietly noticing things others overlooked. The advantage wasn't speed, it was perspective. There's something rather comforting about that. Experience doesn't always make us quicker. Sometimes it makes us better at seeing. I also began wondering why we admire prodigies so much. Child geniuses make headlines. Young entrepreneurs fill magazine covers. Fast success is easy to tell as a story. But slow success is harder. It's quieter. It doesn't fit neatly into headlines. History remembers the finished sculpture. It rarely shows us the years when the stone looked like, well, just a lump of stone. Maybe that's why so many people underestimate their own lives. They're comparing their rough draft to someone else's final chapter. There's another thing I've noticed. Some of the most interesting people I've ever met don't introduce themselves with impressive titles. They're simply curious. They've taken up astronomy after retirement, started learning Italian because they fell in love with Tuscany, joined a local choir, restored old furniture, researched family history, grown roses that seem almost impossible. They're not trying to reinvent themselves. They're following little threads of fascination. And somehow, Those threads gradually weave an entirely new chapter. There's a lovely phrase from the poet Rainer Maria Rilke. He encouraged people to live the questions, not rush towards answers, just live with the questions long enough. That feels surprisingly relevant here, because many of the people we've talked about weren't chasing greatness. They were simply following something interesting, one small curiosity at a time. The more I explored these stories, the more one thing became clear. History isn't actually full of people who suddenly transformed late in life. It's full of people who had quietly been becoming themselves all along. The world simply noticed later. And perhaps that's the part biographies forget to tell us. They show us the harvest, not the seasons. So here's something to notice this week. Pay attention to the people around you. The neighbor learning photography, the friend who's suddenly fascinated by astronomy, the man sketching in the cafe, the woman filling notebooks with family stories. You never really know which chapter someone is in, including yourself. Sometimes the most interesting parts of a life don't begin with a dramatic decision. Sometimes they begin with a quiet curiosity that refuses to go away. And history suggests that's often exactly how remarkable stories begin. I'll see you next time.